I'll recognize myself for questions and address the first one to Dr. Córdova. Dr. Córdova, last year I think you had 40,000 grant proposals that were not funded. You clearly have an abundance of projects to choose from, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, you only approve about 1 out of every 5 proposals. How do you ensure how do you ensure that the American people that only the best projects are being funded? I mentioned in my opening statement a half a dozen that I thought were questionable. It seems to me that none of them should have been funded. I don't see the justification myself, but how do you screen proposals? How do you ensure that they are in the national interest?
As Dr. Zuber mentioned, our merit review process is really the answer to your question, Chairman Smith. Every one of the proposals that we receive, and we receive approximately 50,000 a year, go through our world-lauded merit review process, in which many countries of the world have copied, because it is a process of very high integrity. I want to address just for a second your specific question on particular proposals. I think our very first meeting a week after I took this job, so that would be 4 years ago, was about such proposals. And I took this very personally to examine how these proposals were approved, and personally looked at the individual proposals. Then we had a team of people look at the whole merit review process that was associated with each one. And I was convinced in the end, a process that I had to do myself, I was convinced in the end that each one met our very high standards of intellectual merit and broader impact.
Understand the merit review process. Would you get, let me just pick one out, would you get back to me as to why the merit review process found $450,000 to study why there is no single English word for light blue? Will you get back to me on why that was in the national interest, for example?
Yes, of course. For each one of the projects that's been questioned, we have written a report. They're all online. I do not know about that particular one, but of course, we'll get back to
Okay, I appreciate that. Dr. Zuber, I've talked about this before, but China is reportedly investing $10 billion in quantum research, far more than the United States. How can the U.S. stay competitive, and isn't that a threat and a danger for China to keep outspending us in so many of these research areas?
Well, quantum is, of course, incredibly important for national security, but also on the financial system as well, since cybersecurity affects financial transactions and actually personal transactions, the energy grid, et cetera. So there are a variety of places in the U.S. government that invest in cybersecurity, and also the private sector as well, and we need some communication there. But I think a key thing that we have to have is we need coordination among different agencies. Some are on the classified side, some are on the unclassified side.
Right.
But the basic research, is done on the unclassified side, and there needs to be some crosstalk in terms of what is actually needed early on. And then that can be communicated, and then the classified side can take it over. Another thing that I would say is that we need to be thinking about our education system as well and evolving it. So how many programs have quantum engineering? Okay, MIT doesn't even have quantum engineering as a discipline, and we need to be thinking about.
Can't you change
although
that?
we certainly are teaching those sorts of things, but we don't have a specific program on it.
Okay.
And I think research universities ought to be thinking about developing those programs to train the next generation of researchers that are needed to take on this.
Let me go to my next question. I assume you'll have some influence in trying to persuade MIT to have a program in quantum engineering, right?
I think I might be able to.
Okay, good. Last question is this. The FBI recently shared concerns that countries like China are exploiting U.S. academic institutions and are taking advantage of the federal research funding. They're also trying to indoctrinate students. Do you share the FBI's concerns?
There certainly is some legitimacy to those concerns. Certainly, the U.S. needs to interact with China. They're a global power. There are things that it makes sense for us to collaborate on. It makes sense for us to attract talented Chinese students. We ought to work hard at keeping the best people in the U.S. after they get their degrees. But we need to do a much better job in terms of training those students and actually our professors about issues of intellectual property, so that we can respect the inventions and achievements of our people in the universities.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zuber. We'll go to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for questions.